By the 1890s, the United States, with its vast territory, immense wealth, and 65 million people, was conscious of its place as one of the world's greatest powers. History has shown that tiny nations on the fringes of rising empires have much to fear, and this was true of Cuba. Sitting just 100 miles south of the continental United States, Cuba was still under the control of the ailing Spanish Empire in the 1890s, but US interests and culture had muscled in. But when America and Spain came to blows, Cuba managed to narrowly avoid becoming another part of the United States, though it sacrificed much of its freedom to do so. The US and Cuba had become entwined throughout the 19th century. Cuba's social elite were educated and socialized in America. Americans controlled many of the mines, plantations, and ranches, while 87% of Cuba's exports went to the United States. The influence of the United States on the island was made clear in 1894 with the Wilson-Gorman Tariff on sugar imports. This law decimated the Cuban sugar industry and triggered an economic and social crisis on the island. This hardship led to unrest, and then outright rebellion by the Cubans against the Spanish authorities, who were incapable of dealing with the problems. Cuba's rebellion was widely supported in the US. The Republican platform for the 1896 election openly declared its support for Cuban independence to help remove European imperial power in the Americas. There were, of course, economic interests, with many American businessmen having investments wrapped in the island. The undeniable brutality of the Spanish response, led by General Valeriano Butcher Weyler, which led to the deaths of some 100,000 people through violence and a scorched earth policy. Although blame for the Spanish-American War has been laid at the feet of the Yellow Press, fanning the flames of conflict, the truth was that America was already too invested in Cuba to ignore it. President William McKinley was resistant to the calls for war, but not immune to them. As the Cuban rebellion worsened through 1897 and US financial interests suffered more, he was under pressure to act. His administration negotiated with the Spanish and pressured them to promise reforms and grant Cubans more freedom. However, in early February 1898, a letter by the Spanish ambassador in Washington was leaked, where he mocked McKinley and revealed that Spain had no intention of following through on its reforms. The letter offended the American public, and cries for direct intervention grew, and just a week later, they became irresistible. On February 15th, the battleship USS Maine exploded while docked in Haven Harbor, taking 266 American lives with it. Historians believe an internal issue caused the tragedy. At the time, there was only one explanation: Spain. There was no avoiding war now, as citizens, journalists, and politicians united in the cry, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." On April 11, 1898, McKinley sought Congress's permission to intervene against the Spanish. Public pressure had become too great. By most accounts, though, the rebels were winning and looked likely to kick Spain out of their own. They didn't need a US intervention. Something else was afoot. One theory holds that the US was afraid of a repeat of the Haitian rebellion if the rebels won. The Haitians had slaughtered the whites on the island after defeating the French. That the racially mixed Cubans might unleash the same treatment upon the Americans, who held such a disproportionate power over their economy, wasn't a fear easily dismissed. Then there was the simpler rationale that Cuba might be added to the US's vast dominion. Its valuable plantations would be a powerful economic asset, at least to some. To others, like Senator Henry Teller of Colorado, the acquisition of Cuba was dangerous. An influx of Cuban sugar would destroy the American sugar market. Beet sugar was a major part of Colorado's economy, and many other states, especially in the South, shared this concern. Teller and his allies in the Senate moved to block any potential Cuban sugar influx by proposing the Teller Amendment, which forbade any permanent US annexation of Cuba. No doubt, there were other reasons to support the Teller Amendment. The racial and religious demographics of Cuba were seen as undesirable to many Americans who did not want them under their flag. Some genuine sympathy for Cuban independence must also have played a part. However, there is no denying the power of business interests in getting the Teller Amendment added to Congress's joint resolution of April 20th, declaring war on Spain. The Spanish-American War was a brief conflict with light casualties. While most of the action played out in Cuba, the US also seized the Philippines and Puerto Rico during the conflict, both with minimal casualties. The bulk of the fighting occurred in Cuba, although the Spanish forces were already weakened after the long rebellion. The US forces landed at Santiago in June and had defeated the Spanish by the end of August. Disease was a far bigger killer than combat, but that did not stop the American ambassador in London famously describing it as a splendid little war. The Treaty of Paris in 1898 formally ended the conflict, granting the US control of Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam. As for Cuba, the US set up a temporary military government to ease its transition from colony to independent nation. The Teller Amendment prohibited a formal annexation, but the military government would test that limit. The government was originally headed by General John R. Bourke, whose first concern was restoring stability and disbanding the rebel militias. But there were others in the occupation government, namely General Leonard Wood, and those in Washington who believed that the US needed to stay. They believed the Cubans weren't capable of governing themselves. They argued that generations of Spanish colonial rule and the perceived racial inadequacy of the Cubans meant that the Cubans were, in the words of one American general, no more fit for self-government than gunpowder is for hell. It would be better to move towards annexation, regardless of what the Teller Amendment said. In December 1899, Wood replaced Bourke as military governor of Cuba. Wood continued the public works programs begun under Bourke and began building an American-style education and judicial system, hoping to shape Cuba into a more Americanized society. He stashed the government with Americanized elites while excluding others. His government also heavily restricted voting to just 5% of the population through a combination of literacy, property, and military service requirements. The goal was to isolate the voices of regular Cubans in favor of the pro-American ones who would facilitate annexation. Of course, the Cubans were not ignorant of this. Many rebel veterans and nationalists organized to try to counter the American conspiracy. In September 1900, their efforts paid off, and they swept the assembly elections, seizing control of the legislature and shattering U.S. hopes of an outright annexation. The nationalists immediately began drawing up a framework for an independent Cuba, and made a clear statement that a perpetual military government would not be accepted. If the Americans wanted an occupation, they'd have to fight the Cubans for it. The McKinley administration had no interest in such a conflict. However, America had too many interests in Cuba to abandon everything. Instead, the Americans used the threat of a continued occupation to compel Cuba to accept a number of humiliating concessions. The US would leave peacefully, but they reserved the right to intervene in affairs on the island if necessary, barred Cuba from forming alliances without US approval, and retained control of Guantanamo Bay. These terms were outlined in the Platt Amendment to a 1901 Army Appropriations Bill. The terms were a blatant violation of Cuban sovereignty, and, combined with America's economic dominance over the island, reduced Cuba to an imperial dependency in practice, even if it was still independent in name. It was an insult, but the price of refusing was too high for a nation already scarred by bloody war. In the words of one Cuban nationalist, it is either annexation or a republic with an amendment. Cuba begrudgingly accepted the Platt Amendment as an addendum to their new constitution in 1902. The US occupation ended on May 20th, 1902, but America had secured dominance over Cuba all the same. They had most of the economic and political benefits of control with practically no costs. In a way, it was a masterclass of imperial strategy. Only the Teller Amendment and the political resistance of Cuban nationalists saved Cuba from the fate of Guam or Puerto Rico, which remains US territories to this day. Instead, with the exception of Guantanamo Bay, Cuba has remained an independent nation ever since.